Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 1st of October and we have some really important news from Vuhledar. We'll then look at Pokrovsk and Toretsk and of course finish off with Kursk. If there is enough popular demand, then in tomorrow's video I'll make a report summarizing what's going on with the 180 ballistic missiles that were launched by Iran into Israel. By then I think that a lot of the dust will have settled to a larger extent than it has now, and we'll be able to make a really informative update surrounding that situation. Well, let's begin by looking at Vuhledar. In yellow, you could see the Russian advances that have occurred over the past 2 days. You also have this large gray zone, which indicates an area where there is a lot of ambiguity and a state of flux due to not exactly knowing where the Ukrainian squads are still located, in which apartment buildings and in which open fields they are currently retreating through. But recently, the Russian forces have, of course, upticked their ground operations within the actual buildings in Vuhledar, not just assaulting the flanks. And you could see that a lot of it has come from this western flank, which, as we talked about in many other videos, was strengthened by capturing Protestivka and then a Russian advance utilizing several armored columns and then dismounting forces, taking over surrounding structures, including the abandoned airstrip and the water facility. And so the Russians had constructed for themselves this really strong forward operating base for troops to then use as a launch pad. It's also an elevated area, but it's also a launch pad to then go into the western outskirts of Vuhledar. That's what occurred around the 30th of September and also early morning of October 1st. And you had a huge array of Russian units involved in this western axis, including the 5th Tank Brigade. And so they were and still are one of the main armored elements that is supporting these assaults. You also have the 40th Marine Brigade, and that unit is sort of split because they have elements pushing out westwards along the highway towards other areas like Zolotaniva, and then more generally, you could say the Velika Novosilka area. But a large portion of the brigade is also operating near Vuhledar at the moment with the support of the 37th Motor Rifle Brigade and the 430th Territorial Motor Rifle Regiment, which is a new unit I hadn't been aware of previously. And they are also involved with the assault operations. Then a bit to the east, this is where you have the 36th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade. This unit is involved and really played a big role with the capture of Vodiane, a lot of the mines that you see either marked with the red color or yellow, so usual Donbasskaya and Pivno Donbasskaya, and also with the eastern foothold. So they did that with the support of elements of the 1st Slavic Motor Rifle Brigade, this DPR unit, which is split now in 3 different parts of the front line, including around Vuhledar, but then also Toretsk, and even in Kursk it has some detachments. So as we zoom in, you'll see some of the footage confirming the Russians being able to penetrate. And when they raise these flags, you see there wasn't that much of an engagement because either the Ukrainian squads located here did remain in their basements and did not try to go out and, confront them directly because of really the fact that they are enveloped from 3 sides, and then the 3rd side, which would be their escape way out. It's so narrow and it would be just overlooked from all directions that it would be very, very dangerous to even embark upon such an operation. That's just one factor. And so you had the ones that were still holed up in here, and you had the ones that were already in the process of withdrawing, squads withdrawing. And so you didn't see that many head-to-head engagements by Russian forces that were making it through and sifting past all of the apartment buildings. So here you have footage from October or September 30th, Russians raising flags in western Vuhledar. That's, of course, from the larger garrison with the 5th Brigade and various Marine forces that were also involved with the storming. They went through and methodically cleared out the apartment buildings to see if they were mined or booby-trapped, and that's also what's taking some of the time. Here you have the 37th Brigade. They raised their flag in the garage cooperative, and this garage facility, it actually wasn't that damaged when you look at it. Of course, some of the roofs were just completely totaled, but for the most part, it does look like most of its skeleton is still standing, and those are also some areas the Ukrainians utilize as fortified positions, besides, of course, the massive apartment buildings with concrete slabs, which also withstood most of the Russian shelling, despite it being so strong in recent days, especially on central Vuhledar, an area where you had the large concentration of Ukrainian troops. To zoom in, you could see that in the eastern section, We have this video here, October 1st, 36th Brigade, they raised their flags on top of high rises and also on top of the windows. Here you have the 36th and 1st Brigades. They raised flags in central Vuhledar. Flags were raised in the city council building. And the only area where we haven't seen confirmed ground presence is really this central corridor, which consists of two blocks, you could say, two complexes. I'm going over them with this red perimeter. And just based on where the Russians are currently located, they will reach that point in the very near future as they're just making the preparations on the perimeter and on the outskirts. And then they're going to go into the center and ensure that there's no longer Ukrainian presence over there. And this is what makes me believe that for the most part, the Ukrainians from the 72nd Brigade were able to leave the village of Vuhledar. Now, the thing is, after that point, there definitely were Russians targeting Ukrainian forces involved with the withdrawal and the regrouping further northwards in Vuhledar, but we don't have any concrete information on the extent of the damage caused to Ukrainian convoys, for instance, or troops. And also just based on the fact that there isn't any footage as of the past 2 days showing large Ukrainian casualties in the high rises themselves. Of course, something like that could come out in the future because we're still just in the process of clearing out a lot of these regions. It does imply that the final Ukrainian garrison, the final one that either had to retreat or suffered some large casualties in fighting with Russians here or during a withdrawal, that it was rather small in percentages when you look at the totality of the 72nd Brigade. But you can't just look at the past few weeks in isolation because this unit has been operating here since August of 2022. And so, what is it, like 31 months, something like that, of just constant engagement in Vuhledar. And throughout that time period, of course, there were just huge attrition rates. And then when you add it up, of course, it comes out to be a rather significant number. Likewise, at the beginning of the Russian shaping operations here, and then actual all-out assaults, whether it being late 2022, mid 2023, those ones also yielded extremely high losses for the Russian side, looking in the hundreds of damaged or destroyed armored vehicles, tanks, and troops alike. The thing is, after getting accustomed to the dynamics of the battlefield here, understanding where the Ukrainians were strongest, and then finding weak points, that adaptation is what allowed the Russians at this point in time to actually take it over. And so the groundwork had already been laid. And the reason why it extended so long is also, of course, due to the tenacious fighting of the 72nd Brigade. Because remember, they did not receive any brigade level rotation during that time period, which is just crazy to think about. Because we'd expect that every couple of months, there's going to be some sort of brigade rotation in a heated part of the front line. But then you're looking at this 2 years plus without any such support coming in. Only recently did you have some territorial defense battalions come in and help reinforce Vuhledar, act as perhaps a vanguard force protection as the rest of the unit of the 72nd Brigade withdrew from Vuhledar. But even that did not mean that the troops, the original forces that were in the garrison here at the front line, were allowed to leave and just go to the rear entirely. Even if they were able to withdraw from Vuhledar in the past couple of days, then they are now setting up positions in the fields in the hinterlands or in Vuhledar. And so their gist of combat is not over by any means. But it really is interesting how the commander of the unit, Ivan Vinik, he has been in charge for a rather long time. And is, when you're looking at it, analyzing his actions on the brigade level, because of course he doesn't get to decide if his units are rotated out. Given the set of circumstances that he was presented with, he did a very good job with holding on to the particular village. And of course, there's the elevation advantage and the advantage of having all those concrete slabs. But nonetheless, coming up against a larger Russian garrison, especially in recent times, because you're looking at least 5,000 Russian soldiers involved with the assault on Vuhledar itself. When you add up the actual number of units and their size on paper, then it comes out to be in the tens of thousands, but we're not actually looking at that large of a Russian force assaulting one locality. Maybe more generally, if you're going to add up all the brigade sizes and the regiments here, then you reach that number, but then you're looking at a region that spans, dozens of kilometers from Novodonetsk all the way up to like Marinka to the north. But the point is, now there's been some sort of leadership shakeup, and it happened at one of the worst times because it happened right as they were trying to get the effort to hold on and then eventually withdraw towards the new positions in Vuhledar, which they have not really been accustomed to as a frontline village that they're now going to have to defend for a protracted period of time. That would at least be their desired outcome. So now, as they're in this hectic state, they also have to shift their command structure. And Vinik, it's being reported that he's been promoted, but I don't know exactly to which post. Sometimes the definition of promotion could be a bit bent with you, like it could be ambiguous and not specified, and then you don't exactly know if it was done in order to boost him up or if it was done to actually create a change in the leadership. And that's interesting because there was also been previous criticisms of the way in which promotions were done. So, for instance, you had the command structure within the 115th Brigade, which was involved with the breakthrough of the Russians in Cheratina, and then some of those leaders they were ended up integrating into the 128th Brigade and given higher ranking roles there, and so that also was subjected to criticism. But yeah, more generally, I would just be interested to see the casualty rates for the specific brigade, especially looking at infantry companies that were involved with very hostile fighting within Vuhledar itself throughout this entire time period. And then also getting an idea of the amount of vehicular losses and troop losses, even if they're wounded, on the route of several kilometers back to the rear, you could say, towards Uspenivska and Vuhledar. But now, of course, that's going to change because the Russian forces, they did not endure heavy casualties in their assaults around Vuhledar that are now beginning to culminate in the town itself. That means that they do still have the ability, they have the energy to then keep on pushing forward. And it's going to be easier in Vuhledar in the sense that there aren't as many high-rise building structures that are so well fortified and were so prepared over a course of 2 years plus. You just don't have that here. Here it's perhaps there are some duplexes if I'm going to zoom in enough, but it's mainly just private residential areas. It's more dispersed. Also, a valley leads directly into Vuhledar. You could see it over here on the map. And so the Russians, they're going to make an effort to take over surrounding heights before an assault, and then also assault directly through the valley using armored columns concurrently. And that's going to make it very hard for the already beleaguered forces that are trying to retreat to then conduct even more defensive attempts in an area that they are relatively new to, in the sense that they didn't have all this time to prepare defenses. You could look at the nearby perimeters. You don't have that much trench density, and there's an open question as to whether there really are even troops manning them at the current moment in time. And I say that because these trenches are so close to the front line, and the Russians in the past have been able to decimate them utilizing their artillery, and it's created an incentive a lot of times for Ukrainian troops not to utilize their trenches if they're not connected to tree lines and just go into basements and houses, and that's where they congregate, and that's much more of a safe option. So when it comes to Russian advances, you could see that around Vuhledar, it's at a minimum, 6 square kilometers, but of course, it will be more as time goes on and we get official confirmation of houses being just fully cleared out. That would include the central and northeastern corners, and then here you could see additional territory taken as well. Within the north, you have the landfill taken over just northwest of the Pivne Donbasskaya, or I should say Yuzhno Donbasskaya mine, which amounts to 4.6 square kilometers. Also, you can see the Russians already making efforts to expand northwest of this coal mine. This one is really significant. It's pretty close to Vodyane. The Russians were able to storm it. When was that? September 13th. And since then, they've turned it into a forward operating base, and it serves as a launching pad, you could say, for Russian armored columns to then push along a very specific route, this one over here, to reach the southeastern outskirts of Vuhledar. So you're already seeing that in action right now because of this advance along a local route. It could even be paved, if I'm not mistaken. And in the process, they've taken over additional agricultural facilities and open fields. You can see the location that was taken over by the Russian side. And it is a part of the initial DRG and harassment efforts to the Ukrainians that are trying to retreat and recuperate around the Vuhledar area. Now, besides the fact that Vuhledar, just based on the merits, is much more difficult to defend, it's much more difficult as a fortress to hold on to for long periods of time than Vuhledar. Looking past it, the loss of Vuhledar really would open up a lot of routes for the Russians. There are paved routes going westwards and northwards, so Novoukrayinka would be on the chopping block. although that could be targeted really regardless of what happens here in Bukhaevlenka due to the Russian positions just north of Prechestivka. Besides that fact, it would mean the Russians would be able to penetrate Ukraine's rear in a sense because they'd have this route to lead directly into Uspanivka, and then they'd be able to bypass a lot of the sluggish engagements in Antonivka, Romanivka. There were so many other settlements here. This entire chain of villages would be not encircled, but it would be developed from the west and also from the east. And also, right now, you're already seeing pressure being mounted onto those Ukrainian forces from the south. Let's actually click on that to see and get an idea of what the Russians are doing. So here you have from the, what is this, from today, 0.64 kilometers territory captured just south of Kateryivka. Again, very intentional acts of attack because, again, they're utilizing the local tree lines probably to get closer and pushing with also armored vehicles that dismount. At this point, they've been able to cross over the ponds and have reached this local paved route that feeds directly into Kateryivka. So, of course, the Russians now, you can see they're making plans to shape the battlefield in a way that would position them much closer to the settlement itself and then fire artillery there from higher elevated positions, mortars, whatever it may be. So here we can see the defensive efforts by Ukraine's 79th Air Assault Brigade. They conducted artillery strikes and dropped grenades onto Russian squads. So the common theme here is that you had a rather large Russian grouping of vehicles cross over and dismount a lot of their forces. A lot of those forces, of course, were then picked off by the grenades because it was out in the open and they didn't have much of an area to escape towards. We don't know when this footage was taken from, but it's probably earlier than October 1st. It's from the 72nd Brigade. They had a mutual BMP-2 duel. So the Ukrainian BMP-2 and the Russian one, they encountered along a vertical route in open fields northwest of Vuhledar, probably a part of a Russian attempt to push back any sort of Ukrainian efforts to hold a corridor to Vuhledar. Perhaps it was a part of a evacuation, and so they engaged with one another. The Ukrainian BMP-2 came out victorious, and by the end of the video, the Ukrainians show us the Ukrainian crew actually driving the Russian BMP-2 and taking it back as a trophy. But again, we're going to do a much deeper analysis of the Vuhledar area. Just as a large takeaway, it's that there isn't a very similar village in terms of its positioning, in terms of what's inside, that makes it so difficult to crack and then forces adaptation and a reliance on flanks. There really isn't a sort of equivalent in southern Donetsk. There are areas that are definitely well fortified, but not because of the nature of the settlements themselves. The closest that I could come to is Kurakove, and then you also have the huge reliance on the southern perimeter. There's a question about how effective these trenches will be. There hasn't been a lot of consensus about whether they're strong or not, and there's a way to sort of tell based on where they're structured, how elaborate they are. But based on size, they at least look large, so that's important for Kurakove. You look at all the other villages here that could serve as possible fallback lines, and none of them really do reach the same level as Vuhledar. That's part of why the Ukrainians were able to resist here for so long. Now, looking south of Selydove, you have here in yellow Russian advances just outside of Sukurnia, both reported by geolocations and Ukrainian sources. Here you can see the Russians advancing and taking over additional parts of the St. Basil mine. They made it into the southern outskirts of the village itself. It's 1.5 square kilometers of territory taken. This is a video of an FPV strike targeting Russian groupings in these houses in Sukurnia. Then to look a bit to the north, you'll see additional open fields amounting to 1.5 square kilometers captured. This is an expansion past the Ukrainsk region where the Russians have the cover of the local landfill, which provides a perfect line of sight leading directly to Sukurnia, which is now under intense Russian bombardment, but also enveloped. You can see the envelopment, especially from the north. This is where another local landfill has been taken over by the Russian side, putting pressure along the rail axis to the south. They've also been able to solidify control over a lot of abandoned trenches, and then from there push forward and knock on the doorstep, you could say, of the northern parts of this village. A bit to the east, you don't have as much activity, but to the south, you already have the Russian troops entering into the first houses. This losing Sukurnia is important, as we said before, because of the glue that it acts as. It acts as a fabric between the outstretched Ukrainian positions near Selydove, and then also in the rear to the Ukrainians that are more isolated in this salient that is already forming around Hirnik, Vovchenka, Alexandropil, all of these regions just on the western bank of the Vavcha River. They would be cut off, not completely, but one of their main conduits for steady supply and communication would be taken over in that case. And then also on a practical level, just based on territory, it would provide a perfect vector to push on the western outskirts of Hirnik, which is definitely a massive Russian objective. But as we said before, they're trying to do everything in their ability not to launch out on assaults due to how large it is and dense with Ukrainian reinforcements. Now, to move on, you can see just a gradual Russian expansion west of Novohordivka, probably being embarked upon by the 61st Naval Infantry Brigade now that they've been moved here. It's a force of around 5,000 men, maybe 4,000, and they are active with these fields, largely utilizing armored columns. I've seen BTRs and, some tanks may be involved as well with this garrison. The goal here would be to secure control of this massive field, or it's this arena that is between the highway, the E50 highway, and then Lysivka and this line of defenses. This area is located on a relatively high elevated area, and it provides us a perfect base to penetrate the line of defense, the second to last line of defense for the Pokrovsk region from a new area. It could be from an opening in some of these villages or directly through them. Also, from the southern perspective, if you sort of go down and taking control over these regions would give the Russians access to the northern flank of Selydove from an even more compromised position. And then also it gives you an outpost to really overlook and fire upon the entire Ukrainian rear leading into these areas that we just discussed. Now, to move on to Mykolaiivka, we have the Russian advance here, amounting to 0.7 square kilometers nearly. The geolocation, which helped us understand the Russians have expanded control to most of Mykolaiivka, is from the deep state drone video that they published showing what they say are Russian soldiers executing 16 Ukrainian POWs. And the actual footage was then geolocated by Russian mappers, and it was utilized as proof that the Russians had advanced. So it does make me believe that deep state is accurate with the representation of the situation. What it does mean is that the Russians have been able to cross over what was imagined to be the second last line of defense for the Mirnohrad Pokrovsk region. You could see it in red over here. It's already been passed. And this has been done through Mykolaiivka directly, with Russian troops going from house to house and then the bushy areas being taken over. So the next natural progression would be to overrun Ukrainian holdings near these windbreaks and near some of the other villages just adjacent to the trenches. As a result of this Russian advance, we're going to measure with the ruler here. They're only about 2 kilometers from the southern outskirts of Mirnohrad. And so this region will become really normal, really accustomed to this fighting, this urban type fighting. This specific 5 kilometer area really is dangerous because it lacks a sort of dense defensive backdrop once you pass over the villages in the line of defense, and it's located along the rail embankment, so it is on a higher elevation, and then it gives the impetus for any advancing force to attack into this Mirnohrad region, which really is detached from the rest of the city. And it's also really important. It would serve as a massive forward operating base and also as a large landfill that overlooks surrounding regions. So it does look like a really high value target for the Russian forces at the moment. Now, to zoom in on Toretsk, we have a few updates. A lot of this urban combat has been released specifically from Ukraine's 4th Battalion. This is their battalion within the 101st Protection Brigade. I think there's another battalion, the 412th, which is operating around Staritsia in the, Vovchansk/Kharkiv area. And so now that unit has been split up. And it used to be, I believe, a presidential security unit. Or sorry, that was the separate presidential brigade, a different units. Specifically, this unit was involved in protection of Kiev itself. Now it's been split up with at least one battalion in the north and one defending in Toretsk, which was definitely needed due to the fact that the Russians had the ability, albeit under very heavy drone bombardment, to cross over the highway over here enter into a large portion of the Selydove area without that much pushback from forces on foot. So now that's being replaced with this new battalion here, which is involved with a lot of the drone strikes targeting those advancing Russian very small squads, because sometimes it's individual, sometimes it's duos or small groups. They're not going in large quantities here anymore. They're just trying to go into house to house, or in a lot of cases apartments, scan for Ukrainian resistance and then engage with them directly, and then also disable any sort of mines that would be threatening to them. Now, as you zoom in here, you could also see that there's a chunk of territory west of the correctional facility, which the Russians appear to have taken over. Nearly, what is it, like 9 hectares? So it's just a region with houses and just a paved road. It's a part of some of the suburbs. You have micro district number 1, a bit here to the north. You have Zabalka to the south, which hasn't really been faced with that much significant attacks recently. But again, the Russians really have concentrated a large chunk of their forces on that inner penetration. Everything else follows through from there on the flanks, and already puts pressure on forces that have to rely upon logistical nodes and organization points. And a lot of that was really conducted through the center, where the fighting has shifted towards prematurely. Now we're looking at Luhansk in relation to Nevsky. By now you could say that almost the entirety of the village is under Russian control. This has been reported by Deep State, for instance, but also Petrenko, a lot of Ukrainian sources admitting that Russian forces involved with the initial foray, which involved huge capture of territory west or east of the village, and then advances through specific ravines and gullies. They were able to penetrate over the past 2 weeks into Nevsky itself. And the village is not really well fortified. It's just private residential areas, very narrow, and runs along one main road. So in that sense, it's very easy for the Russians to then, once they make it in, expand past that. And then the biggest issue for the Russians is, of course, avoiding getting hit by FPV strikes, because that's most of what we see in terms of Ukrainian footage being released from these areas. So the Russians, for instance, they expanded control along this specific gully. It's like 3.85 square kilometers, and then also advance into the northern part of Nevsky, 1.25 square kilometers. And that means that essentially they're along the Zherebets River here. There are some crossings that they may be able to utilize, like this one over here. And so there could be small scale crosses once the Russian forces are able to fully solidify control over the nearby areas, because you have this one salient in particular, which still hasn't been verified as a gray zone or under Russian control. So I'm still marking it as Ukrainian presence. And the objective would be to essentially cleanse out these final pockets where there may be troops hiding in tree lines, get a solid line around the Zherebets River, and then from there work on advancing southwards to clear out the rest of the pockets that are still resisting in Terany on Polivka, and then also cross over along some of the bridges in very narrow parts of the Zherebets River. You can see how the Russians already crossed over in an area like Makivka. I think that they took over what's called height 216.8. I might be mixing up the numbers, but there is a local height just west of this settlement, and the Russians have now stepped foot in. And there's just Ukrainian footage of an FPV strike directly onto the foliage here, but I couldn't see any Russian soldiers there. Nonetheless, it does imply that you do have a solid base crossing over. It's relatively easy to do so because of how narrow it is and because of all the crossings, which means the Russians here, they do have plans. It could be southwards to help assist with clearing out the remaining pockets here, or it could be westwards towards Ukraine's rear in an area that is relatively undefended until you reach a really dense amount of trenches about 7 kilometers in. And finally, from the Kursk area, there may be certain parts of the 234th Air Assault Regiment that are not just located in the Glushkovo/Kuranovo area. They may also be present to the east here in the Borki-Plekhovo attacks. And I just saw that mentioned by Ukrainian sources. So I just know that if I have an icon marked on one part of the Kursk front line, there's a very good chance that certain companies are split off, or battalions are split off and are operating all across the areas wherever they're needed. One such example would be over here in what we call the Gri district. And so here you could see Russian advance, which amounts to 45 square kilometers, but I can't fully confirm if Plekhovo is under Russian control. Let's zoom in and see a video. This is from September 29th. It's from Ukraine's 129th Territorial Defense Brigade. This unit is really infamous for being able to split up effectively. It splits up and deals with multiple fronts at the same time. Each battalion is really independent. And so the headquarters, I don't know how much of significance it really has anymore, but now it appears as if the entire brigade was moved to get involved with defending the southern flank of Suja. That would be the main idea, to send in these troops that may not be the best trained for offensive activities, but can at least act as manpower holding the southern flank where they're desperately needed given Russian advances here and supplemental resources. So Borky, Spalnoy, all of that is understandable as being under control of the Russian forces. But then what is still not fully confirmed is in relation to Plechovo. You have the 129th Brigade conducting FPV strikes and shelling onto large Russian column, and then troop concentrations that made it out or trying to just make a presence known for themselves in the regions near the village and in a lot of the forested areas that are pretty close to the Psel River. The Psel River is over here, and this acts as a major dividing line with some buffer to the east where the Ukrainians are still present in a lot of plantations. And so this may be the new front line based on those geolocations of Ukrainians targeting those forward Russian troops. But then you have this video from October 1st from the Russian side where they conducted shelling onto Ukrainian squads that were operating in the eastern parts of Plechovo in open fields and then made it into forested areas. So there is a bit of nuance in the sense that there could still be fluctuations, and maybe it would be better to show that this area marked here in X is still in a gray zone. But nonetheless, it is an important development for the Russians that they have been able to prevent any sort of fears of a broader Ukrainian incursion into Belitsa and all these other villages. Now they've been able to solidly secure those regions. They have done so for more than a month and a half now. But now they're actually taking proactive steps to reversing the initial Ukrainian advances across the Psel River. And it's all part of a broader shaping operation, which is going to take a lot of time. But the goal eventually would be to undermine the southern flank of Suja and then push into it from there. So, yeah, that's all I have for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.